She was too calm for a woman who had just been sold. Zadai Harland stood in the doorway of a house that was now her prison. Her eyes weren't filled with fear. They were moving across the destruction with the cold precision of a mathematician calculating an equation. Broken furniture, stacks of unwashed plates, a man in the corner, swaying with a bottle in his hand, barely able to stand upright. This was meant to be her new life, her punishment for a debt she supposedly owed. But she didn't look afraid. She looked like she was taking inventory. Gideon Whitmore, the man swaying in the corner, didn't understand. He didn't understand why a woman would accept this fate so easily. Why she carried only a single small bag, as if this was a planned trip, not a sentence. Why her hands were steady when his own couldn't stop shaking. He didn't understand anything that was happening, but Zadai understood everything, and that was the most dangerous part. She set her bag down with a movement that was too deliberate, too measured. It was as if every action had been rehearsed 1,000 times, as if standing in this neglected house with this broken drunk was exactly where she had planned to be all along. Forced marriages were always about power. The man with the money bought a life, and the powerless person accepted their fate. That's how it had always been. But something in the way Zadai looked at that broken house suggested the rules had just changed. The woman everyone thought was trapped had actually just walked into a trap of her own design. What nobody knew, what Gideon couldn't possibly imagine, was that this marriage wasn't the end of anything. It was the final move in a game that had started 5 years ago. A game played with more patience and precision than a master chess player. A game where every single sacrifice had been calculated down to the last penny. And Zadai Harland never, ever played to lose. The question wasn't whether she would escape. The question was what she had really come here to take. The house smelled of old whiskey and years of neglect. Zadai stepped across the threshold, her eyes methodically scanning the main room. Broken chairs were propped against the walls like wounded soldiers. Plates with food dried hard as stone were stacked near a fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in weeks. The floor was covered in a layer of dust and grime so thick you couldn't see the wood beneath. This was supposed to be her home now. Gideon Whitmore swayed in the corner, a bottle hanging loosely from his fingers. He stared at her with eyes that held no focus, no recognition of the transaction that had just taken place. He had no idea his life had been rewritten in the time it took for a signature to dry. She had expected this. In fact, she had planned for it. Zadai set down her small bag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it. 5 years of silent, careful work. 5 years of invisible accumulation and strategic patience had all led to this single moment. But looking at Gideon now, a wreck of a man, she realized the challenge was more immediate than she'd calculated. He was worse than she'd thought. He was more broken. The rancher stumbled toward a chair, missed it completely, and had to catch himself on the edge of a dusty table. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had clearly once been strong and powerful. Now, his hands shook so badly he could barely set the bottle down without it clattering against the wood. This was the man whose signature was on dozens of contracts. The man whose property stretched across more land than most people would see in their entire lifetime. And another man, Dalton Riggins, now owned every single piece of it. Or at least, he thought he did. Zadai moved through the room, her steps deliberate and sure. She picked up a plate, examined the filth on it, and set it aside. She opened a cabinet and found it almost bare. The pantry was even worse. 3 jars of old preserved vegetables and a sack of grain that had been chewed through by mice. Through the grimy window, she could see a barn leaning dangerously to one side. Fences had huge gaps in them. Fields that should have been planted weeks ago were overgrown with weeds. This wasn't just a house in disrepair. It was an entire life in collapse. Gideon watched her, a deep confusion growing in his dazed expression. "You can leave," he mumbled, his voice thick. "I didn't ask for this." Zadai didn't answer right away. She continued her silent inventory, her mind calculating and planning. The house could be functional in 2 days, the barn, 3. The fields would take longer, but they weren't the most important part of her plan. What mattered was the man. What mattered was making him useful again. She finally turned to face him, looking at him directly for the first time since she'd walked through the door. Her voice was calm and steady. "How long since you ate something that wasn't poured from a bottle?" Gideon blinked, thrown by the directness of the question. "What does it matter?" "It matters," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because you need to be sober by tomorrow." He let out a laugh, but it was a hollow, bitter sound with no humor in it. "Why? So Riggins can parade me around town like some trained animal? Show everyone what happens when you cross him?" Zadai's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in her eyes. It was a calculation, being adjusted on the fly. Gideon had more awareness left than she had anticipated. Underneath all the whiskey and self-destruction, there was still a spark of sharpness. She could work with that. It was more than she'd hoped for. "Dalton Riggins thinks he owns you," Zadai said quietly. "He thinks he owns me. He thinks he owns half this territory and every single thing in it." Gideon stared at her, trying to decipher the sound of her voice. It wasn't resignation. It definitely wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Something cold and hard and dangerous. "But men like Riggins," Zadie continued, moving toward the fireplace where a stack of wood sat waiting. "They always make one critical mistake." She knelt down and began arranging kindling with practiced, efficient hands. "They assume the people they crush stay crushed." The fire would be burning by nightfall. The house would be warm. And tomorrow, whether Gideon Whitmore understood it yet or not, the real work would begin. Because Zadie hadn't spent 5 long years building an invisible empire just to watch it all crumble now. She had come too far, and she had sacrificed too much. And the broken man slumped in that chair, drowning his sorrows in whiskey and despair, held information he didn't even know he possessed. Information that she desperately needed to burn Dalton Riggins to the ground. Morning came with the smell of freshly baked bread. Gideon woke up on the floor near the fireplace, his head pounding like a drum, his mouth tasting like old metal and regret. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back in broken pieces. The contract. The woman. The cruel way Riggins had smiled, like a predator watching its prey walk right into a trap. He struggled to push himself upright, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Zadai was standing at the table, her hands working dough with steady, practiced movements. The fire was burning warm and bright in the hearth. The floor had been swept clean. 3 plates, washed and gleaming, sat stacked near the basin. The room looked different. It felt different. It felt like a home. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Her voice was simple and direct. "There is water in the basin. Wash your face." Gideon's first instinct was to refuse, to try and assert some pathetic last shred of authority in a house he didn't even truly own anymore. But his body moved before his pride could stop it. The water was shockingly cold. It jolted his skin and his mind, awake. When he straightened up, wiping his face with a clean cloth that had been laid out for him, Zadai was sliding a piece of bread from a flat stone she'd placed near the fire. She set the bread in front of the spot where he had been sleeping, along with a cup of something that was steaming. "Eat." He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to understand what kind of strange game this woman was playing. But his hunger was a raw, gnawing thing, and it won the battle easily. The bread was still warm, and it was the best thing he'd tasted in years. The drink was bitter, some kind of herb mixture he didn't recognize, but it cut right through the thick fog in his head. Zadai ate her own portion in silence, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the window. She was watching something. Always watching. "You worked for the Harrow family," Gideon said finally, the words surprising him as much as they did her. I remember. 5 years ago, maybe 6. Her hands stopped moving for the briefest of moments, then she continued tearing her bread. I worked in many houses. But you were at the Harrows place, Gideon insisted, his memory sharpening now, pieces starting to slide into place through the clearing haze in his mind. You were there when Riggins came to collect. When they lost everything. He looked at her, really looked at her. You were in the room. The kitchen. I saw you through the doorway. Zadie finally looked at him directly, for the first time that morning. Her expression was a blank mask, revealing nothing, but her attention had completely shifted. He had said something that mattered. You remember more than most men who drink the way you do. I remember enough, Gideon said, setting down his bread. I remember Riggins showing them documents. Numbers that didn't match what Mr. Harrow claimed he owed. I was there on other business. I saw Harrow's face when he realized the ledgers had been changed. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Zadie stood up, moved to the fireplace, and began banking the coals to keep the fire low and steady. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. Riggins has a talent for changing numbers, making debts appear where they didn't exist before, making properties transfer hands through contracts people don't even remember signing. She turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his. You witnessed that with Hargrove. Did you witness it with others? Gideon felt a cold knot form in the pit of his stomach. He was suddenly remembering fragments of conversations he had overheard. Documents he had been asked to witness without reading them carefully. Meetings where Riggins had clapped him on the back and assured him that everything was legitimate, proper, and above question. How many? Zadie asked quietly. I don't. Gideon started, then stopped himself. His hands began to shake again, but this time, it wasn't from the need for whiskey. I don't know. A dozen? More? And those documents? The ones you witnessed? Where does Riggins keep them? The bank? His office? He has a safe behind. Gideon cut himself off, the full, horrifying realization dawning on him. You want to get into his office? Zadie's expression didn't change, but something in her posture, in her stillness, confirmed it. I don't want anything, she said, her voice even and flat. I already own what I came for. A chill went down Gideon's spine. What did she mean by that? What I need now, she continued, is proof. Proof of what? That Dalton Riggins built his entire empire on fraud. That every property he claims, every debt he collects, every contract he enforces, is built on a foundation of manipulation and lies. Zadie moved closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And that you, Gideon Whitmore, witnessed most of it. The weight of her words settled over him like a physical thing, crushing the air from his lungs. All those years, all those signatures, all those moments when he had told himself it wasn't his business, that Riggins knew what he was doing, that a man that important didn't make mistakes. Gideon looked at the woman standing in his kitchen. The woman who had been forced to marry him as some kind of payment. The woman who had just spent the night cleaning his house and making him food when she should have been planning her escape. Who are you really? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zadie's eyes held his for a long, silent moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a lifetime. Someone who learned to count every coin, remember every face, and wait for exactly the right moment. She picked up their empty plates. And that moment is coming a lot faster than Riggins thinks. But there was more. Gideon could feel it. There was more she wasn't saying. Because if she already owned what she came for, why did she need proof? Why did she need him? What exactly was Zadie Harland really planning to do? Dalton Riggins arrived 3 days later. Zadie heard the horses long before she saw them. 2 animals, both well-fed and strong, moving at a confident pace that suggested their rider was in no particular hurry. She set down the bucket of water she was carrying and moved to the window. Gideon was outside, mending a fence post. His hands were steady. For the first time in months, they were steady. That was going to be a problem. Riggins dismounted with the easy confidence of a man surveying property he believed was his. His coat was made of fine wool, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust of the trail. He glanced at the house, then at Gideon working in the field, and his expression flickered. Something close to confusion crossed his features before he quickly smoothed it away. Zadai stepped out onto the porch before he could even raise his hand to knock. "Mr. Riggins." He turned to her, and a smile instantly appeared on his face. But it was a cold thing. It never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore. How, domestic?" His gaze moved past her, taking in the swept porch, the newly repaired shutter, the steady plume of smoke rising from the chimney. "You've been busy." There was work to be done. Indeed. Riggins walked closer, his boots making heavy sounds on the wooden steps. "And I see my investment is finally sober enough to hold a hammer. How remarkable." Zadai didn't respond. She had learned a long, long time ago that men like Riggins didn't speak to have conversations. They spoke to hear the sound of their own voices. He moved to the edge of the porch, looking out at Gideon. "I came to ensure things were progressing as expected. You understand? A man invests in property, he wants to see it properly maintained." The way he said the word property made it chillingly clear he wasn't talking about the land. "Everything is as it should be," Zadai said, her voice perfectly even. Riggins turned back to her, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "You know, I've been thinking about you, Mrs. Whitmore, about how quickly you accepted this arrangement. Most women in your position would have fought, screamed, made things difficult. Most women in my position have other options." True. He stepped closer, so close that she could smell the faint scent of tobacco on his breath. "But you're not most women, are you? I've been asking around. You worked in the Hargrove house, the Preston place. You even spent time at the Carmichael estate right before it burned down." Zadai's expression remained a perfect mask of calm, but her pulse quickened. He had been investigating her. He was connecting dots she had hoped would remain invisible. "You seem to have been present for a lot of interesting moments," Riggins continued, his voice a low purr. "Always in the background. Always quiet. Always watching." His smile grew wider, colder. "One might think you make a habit of observing other people's business." "I make a habit of surviving." "Of course." Riggins pulled a folded paper from the inside of his coat. "Which brings me to the real reason for my visit. I need Gideon to witness a document. Nothing complicated. A simple transfer of property from a man who can no longer pay his debts." He held the paper out, but Zadai didn't take it. "Whose property?" "The Caldwell Ranch. You wouldn't know it. Small holding north of here. The owner is indisposed." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. It suggested the owner hadn't become indisposed by accident. "Gideon has witnessed transfers like this before, many times. He won't object." This was it, the moment she had been calculating. Riggins was still operating as if nothing had changed. He still thought Gideon was his trained witness, his complicit tool. But everything had changed, and Riggins didn't know it yet. "I'll give him the document," Zadai said, finally reaching for the paper. Riggins pulled it back just slightly. "You'll give it to him, but I will be watching to ensure he signs. I will be watching very, very carefully, Mrs. Whitmore." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because something about this situation troubles me. Something I can't quite define. And if I discover you are playing some kind of game, if I find out you are anything other than what you appear to be, I will make you regret the day you were born. Do you understand me? Zadai met his gaze directly. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with unspoken threats. I understand perfectly, she said quietly. Riggins smiled again, satisfied. He pressed the paper into her hand and turned toward his horse. I'll be back tomorrow for the signed document. Have Gideon ready. He rode away without a single look back, leaving Zadai standing on the porch with a piece of paper in her hand and a shard of ice in her veins. Riggins was suspicious. He was watching her every move, and the window for her plan to work was closing much, much faster than she had anticipated. She needed to move now. Gideon came inside as the sun began to dip below the horizon, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands dirty from a full day's work. He saw Zadai sitting at the table, papers spread out before her, and he stopped dead in his tracks. He came to warn you, Gideon said. It wasn't a question. He came to test me. Zadai gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He did, slowly, his eyes fixed on the documents covering the table. He recognized some of them. Property deeds, loan contracts, witness statements written in his own shaky handwriting. But others were unfamiliar, covered in numbers and signatures he'd never seen before. These are my debts, Gideon said, picking up one of the papers. His voice was hollow, dead. Every loan Riggins ever gave me, every extension, every compound interest calculation that never made any sense. But I signed anyway, because I was desperate and drunk and stupid. Yes. He set the paper down, his hands starting to shake again. Why are you showing me this? To remind me how completely he owns me. Zadai reached across the table and turned one of the documents around so he could read it clearly. It was a transfer notice, a sale of debt. From Dalton Riggins to a private investor named Merrick Vane. It was dated 4 months ago. The amount was staggering. Gideon stared at it, his mind refusing to comprehend what he was seeing. Who is Merrick Vane? A man who works for me. The words hung in the air between them, solid and heavy. Gideon looked up at her, his face a mask of disbelief, certain he had misheard her. What? Zadai pulled another document from the stack, and then another and another. Each one showed the same pattern. Debts purchased from Riggins by this mysterious Merrick Vane. Properties transferred, loans acquired, all of them connected to Gideon's holdings. All of them now owned by a ghost. I have been buying your debts for the past year, Zadai said calmly, as if she were discussing the weather. Piece by piece, through intermediaries, through arrangements Riggins never questioned because he was still making a profit. He never looked too closely at the buyer. That's impossible. You were a cook, a servant. I was someone who listened. Zadai's voice was steady as steel. Someone who watched, who remembered every single conversation, every careless word, every moment of weakness. I worked in 13 houses over 5 years. Houses where important men drank too much and talked too freely. Houses where contracts were left on tables. I learned exactly how Riggins operates by watching him from the shadows. Gideon pushed back from the table, lurching to his feet, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossible thing he was hearing. You planned this. All of it. The debt that forced you to marry me. You orchestrated your own sale. I created a debt that didn't exist, Zadai corrected him, her voice sharp. I made Riggins believe he was forcing me into this marriage as a payment. But what he really did was give me legal access to your property, your records, and your testimony. My testimony about what? About every fraudulent document you ever witnessed, every property Riggins stole, every family he destroyed using manipulated contracts and fabricated debts. Zadai stood up, facing him directly, her eyes blazing with an intensity he had never seen before. You are his accomplice, Gideon, but you are also the single witness who can bring him down. The weight of it all finally crashed down on Gideon. Years of signing without reading. Years of trusting when he should have questioned. Years of being too drunk or too desperate, or just too weak to see the monster he was helping to create. Why? His voice cracked. Why go through all of this? If you already own my debts, you control everything I have. Why do you need Riggins destroyed? For the first time since he had met her, Zadai's mask of control slipped. Something ancient and painful flickered across her features before she mastered it. Because 23 years ago, Dalton Riggins used the exact same tactics on my father. Her voice was quiet, but it was sharp as broken glass. Fabricated debts, altered contracts, witnesses who signed without reading. My father lost his land, his livelihood, and his will to live. He died thinking he had failed his family. Died believing the shame was his. She moved to the window, staring out at the darkening fields. I was 9 years old. I watched everything we had disappear into Riggins's hands. I watched my mother work herself to death trying to keep us alive. And I swore that one day I would take back what he stole. Not just from my family, from everyone. Gideon sank back into the chair, his entire world reorienting itself around this new, terrifying reality. The woman he thought had been forced into his life had actually forced herself into it. She had built an invisible empire from the shadows. She had manipulated the master manipulator. She had maneuvered Riggins into creating the very trap that would destroy him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Zadie turned from the window. "Now, you decide. You can stay silent, stay safe, and stay drunk. Riggins will never know you betrayed him, because you never will. You'll live out your days on property that I own, working land that I control. You'll be comfortable enough." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Or, you help me finish this. You testify to what you witnessed. You provide the evidence that proves Riggins built his empire on a mountain of lies. And when it is all done, when he loses everything, you get your land back, your dignity back, your life back." The choice was simple, and it was impossible. "He'll destroy me," Gideon whispered. "He already did," Zadai said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I am offering you the chance to rebuild." Outside, the night settled completely over the land. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl called out. Gideon looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at the woman who had systematically dismantled every assumption he had ever had about power and control. He looked at the weapon she had turned herself into. And he made his choice. The first crack in Dalton Riggins's empire appeared on a Tuesday morning. Gideon rode into town with a list Zadai had written for him. Simple supplies. Purchases that wouldn't draw any attention. But when he walked into the general store, he found 3 men arguing near the counter. One of them was clutching a piece of paper, his face flushed red with anger. The store owner just looked uncomfortable. "I'm telling you, I have nothing to do with your loan," the owner was saying. "You need to take this up with the bank." "I tried," the man with the paper shot back. His name was Preston. Gideon recognized him from the lumber mill. "Riggins says I owe twice what I borrowed. Says the interest compounded monthly instead of yearly. But that's not what the original contract said." "Then show him the original contract." "I don't have it. He says it was lost. Says the current terms are all that matter." Preston crumpled the paper in his fist. "He's bleeding me dry. I can't keep up with payments that change every single month." Gideon felt something cold and heavy move through his chest. He had heard these same complaints before, dozens of times over the years. He'd always dismissed them as the grumbling of men who didn't understand finance. But now he understood differently. Now he saw the pattern. He bought what was on his list and left without saying a word to anyone. When he returned to the ranch, Zadie was waiting for him on the porch. She read the look on his face before he even dismounted. "What happened?" Gideon told her about Preston, about the changed terms and the conveniently missing contract. Zadai listened without a single interruption, but her eyes sharpened with every detail. "How many others are there?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know. Preston mentioned 2 other men with similar problems. Said they were planning to confront Riggins together." Zadai nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. "That's good. Let them ask questions. Let them compare their stories. The more people who see the pattern, the harder it will be for Riggins to dismiss them as isolated complaints. But if they organize, if they push too hard," Gideon warned, "Riggins will know something is happening. He'll look for the source of the trouble." "He's already looking," Zadi said, moving to the edge of the porch. "Which is why we need to move faster. I need those documents from his office, the originals, the ones that show what the contracts actually said before he altered them." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the words that would change everything. "I know how to get into his office." Zadai turned to him sharply. "I have a key," Gideon continued, his voice low but steady. "From back when I was still useful to him. Before the drinking got so bad he stopped trusting me with the details. He never asked for it back. Probably forgot I even had it." "Where is it?" "Hidden. Safe." Gideon met her eyes, the weight of his next words hanging between them. "But if I use it, if we get caught, Riggins won't just destroy me. He will destroy you too. Everything you've built. 5 years of work, gone in an instant." "Then we don't get caught." It sounded so simple when she said it, as if breaking into the office of the most powerful man in the territory and stealing his private documents was merely a matter of careful planning. But Gideon was starting to understand that this was how Zadai's mind worked. She didn't see obstacles. She saw steps in a sequence, problems to be calculated and executed. Nothing was impossible, only complex. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, after the saloon closes, when the streets are empty and Riggins is home, counting the money he's taken." Zadie pulled a small worn notebook from her apron pocket. "I need you to draw me a map of his office. Every drawer, every cabinet, where the safe is located. Everything you can remember." Gideon took the notebook and the pencil she offered. His hands were perfectly steady as he began to sketch. This was it. This was real. This was irreversible. Once they took this step, there would be no going back. There'd be no pretending he was just a drunk who signed papers without reading them. He would be actively working against Dalton Riggins, the most dangerous man he had ever known. But as he drew the layout of the office, Gideon realized something else. For the first time in years, his hands weren't shaking because of what he needed. They were steady because of what he was choosing to do. And that made all the difference in the world. Zadai watched him work, her expression unreadable. She had been preparing for this single moment for 5 long years. Every sacrifice, every careful step, every invisible move on a board that no one else even knew existed. It all came down to one night, one office, one set of documents that would finally prove what Dalton Riggins really was. But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that Riggins had received a letter that very morning. A letter from a banker 3 territories away. A letter asking about a man named Merrick Vane, who had been buying up debts at unusually high rates. A letter that had made Riggins start asking some very specific and very dangerous questions. Questions that were about to lead him directly to their doorstep. They never even made it to the office. Riggins arrived at the ranch 2 hours before midnight. There were 3 other men riding with him. Zadie heard them coming and knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something in the careful architecture of her plan had just broken. She moved to the window and saw Riggins dismounting with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had already made a decision. Gideon was in the barn, checking the horses one last time before their planned mission. He didn't see them arrive. He didn't see Riggins gesture to his men to spread out, to cover the house and the barn. He didn't see the violence that was about to unfold. Zadie stepped onto the porch before they could knock. It was always better to control the confrontation than to let them dictate the terms. "Mr. Riggins, this is an unusual hour for a visit." He didn't smile this time. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Where is he?" "Gideon is resting. Whatever business you have can wait until morning." "No," he said, his voice flat. "It can't." Riggins mounted the steps, moving into her personal space with deliberate intimidation. "I received some interesting information today about a man named Merrick Vane, about certain financial transactions that seemed irregular. And when I investigated further, I discovered something fascinating." Zadai's expression remained perfectly calm, but her mind was racing, calculating options, searching for an escape route that wasn't there. "Merrick Vane doesn't exist," Riggins continued, his eyes boring into hers. "Oh, the name is real enough. It appears on contracts, it signs documents. But no one has ever met him. No one can describe him. He's a ghost, a convenient fiction." He leaned closer. "Which made me wonder. Who would go to such elaborate trouble to hide their identity while buying up my debts?" "I wouldn't know." "No, of course not. You're just a simple woman who cooks and cleans and accepts her fate with remarkable calm." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Except you're not simple at all, are you? You're the one who has been systematically purchasing my accounts. You are the ghost." Just then, the barn door creaked open. Gideon emerged, saw the extra horses, saw Riggins standing on the porch, and his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle mounted just inside the barn door. "Don't!" Riggins said, his voice sharp as a whip, without even looking away from Zadie. "My men are faster, and you are outnumbered." Gideon froze, his hand hovering near the weapon, his eyes meeting Zadie's across the dark yard. She gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not yet. Not like this." Riggins finally turned, looking down at Gideon with pure contempt. You've been helping her. I should have known. A man who drinks himself into uselessness suddenly sobers up and starts working his land again. A woman I force into marriage as payment somehow makes his debts disappear. I was so focused on the larger moves, I missed the obvious pattern right in front of my face." He descended the steps, walking toward Gideon with slow, measured steps, like a predator approaching its cornered prey. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been conspiring against me?" "I only found out a few days ago," Gideon said. His voice was steady, despite the raw fear Zadie could see in his eyes. "She did all of this herself." "I don't believe you." Riggins stopped just 3 feet from Gideon. "You witnessed my transactions for years. You saw how I operated. You knew where all the leverage points were. You gave her everything she needed." "I gave her nothing. I was too drunk to give anyone anything." The punch came fast and hard. Riggins was not a young man, but he was still strong, and his fist connected with Gideon's jaw with enough force to drop him to his knees. One of the other men moved forward, grabbing Gideon's arms and hauling him brutally back to his feet. "Stop!" Zadai's voice cut across the yard like a blade. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It was simply a command that carried an undeniable weight. Riggins turned back to her, breathing hard from the exertion. "Or what? You'll do what, exactly? You have no power here, no authority. You are nothing but a clever woman who has finally overplayed her hand." "I have documentation," Zadie said, her voice ringing with confidence she did not feel. "Every fraudulent contract you ever wrote, every debt you fabricated, every property you stole through altered terms and missing originals, all of it is recorded, all of it is verified, and all of it is currently sitting with 3 different people who have instructions to make it public if anything happens to me or to Gideon." The lie came easily. It was natural. It was perfectly timed. She had no such documentation. Not yet. That was what tonight's mission was supposed to have secured. But Riggins didn't know that. He couldn't know that. His eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Am I? Zadie descended the steps, walking toward him with the same measured pace he had used on Gideon. You built your empire on people assuming you had power you didn't actually possess. On threats and implications, and the fear of what you might do. I learned from watching you, Dalton. So ask yourself, can you afford to be wrong? A tense silence stretched between them. The men holding Gideon shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called out to the moon. Riggins stared at Zadie with an expression that was a volatile mix of pure rage and cold calculation. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just realized the hunt was going to be far more interesting than anticipated. You want to play this game? He said quietly. Fine. Let's see who breaks first. But understand this. I have destroyed better people than you, and I will enjoy every single moment of tearing down whatever you think you've built. He gestured to his men. They released Gideon, who stumbled but managed to stay on his feet. Riggins mounted his horse without another word and rode off into the darkness, his men following close behind. Zadie stood in the yard long after the sound of their hooves had faded. Gideon came to stand beside her, touching his jaw gingerly. What do we do now? He asked, his voice shaking. Zadie didn't answer right away. Her plan was in shambles. Her timeline had been blown to pieces, and Riggins was now actively hunting for proof of what she had done. But her bluff had bought them time. Maybe just enough time to turn the lie into the truth. They had 24 hours. 24 hours before Riggins called her bluff. 24 hours to get the proof they needed, or watch everything she had worked for collapse into dust. Gideon retrieved the key from where he had hidden it years ago, wrapped in an oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to Zadie. It wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the immense weight of what they were about to do. The office has a back entrance, he said, his finger tracing the route on the map he had drawn earlier. Riggins uses it when he wants to avoid being seen. It leads into a storage room. From there, you can access the main office without going through the front. Will anyone be there? Not at this hour. He keeps one clerk during the day but always sends him home before sunset. Riggins handles the evening business himself, and he's always at the saloon on Thursday nights. Stays until midnight, sometimes later. Zadie studied the map, committing every last detail to memory. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. We leave in 1 hour. Dress in dark clothes. Bring nothing that makes a sound. The town was dead quiet when they arrived. The streets were empty, the only light and sound spilling from the saloon 2 blocks away. They moved like ghosts through the shadows between the buildings, staying clear of the oil lamps that burned at irregular intervals along the main street. Gideon's key slid into the lock of the back door with a soft, metallic click. The door swung open without a sound. Inside, the office smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. Zadie lit a small candle, shielding its flame with her hand as they moved through the cluttered storage room and into the main office. Gideon pointed to a large filing cabinet against the far wall. That's where he keeps the active contracts, the ones he's still enforcing. Zadie opened it carefully, her fingers flying along the folders until she found what she was looking for. Preston's contract, the Hargrove documents. 3 others she recognized from her years of silent watching and listening. She pulled them out, comparing the current versions to the notes she had made from memory. The numbers didn't match. Interest rates had been changed. Terms had been completely altered. Entire clauses had been rewritten to favor Riggins. Every single document showed clear, undeniable signs of manipulation. The safe, Zadie whispered. Where is it? Gideon moved to a large painting on the wall, lifted it carefully, and revealed a heavy metal door set into the plaster. I don't know the combination. He changed it after I started drinking heavily. Zadai knelt in front of it. She placed her ear close to the cold metal, her fingers working the dial with a patient, practiced precision. She had watched a safecracker once, years ago, at a house where she had been working as a maid. She had memorized the method, the subtle sounds, the feel of the tumblers falling into place. She had practiced on broken locks in private moments when no one was watching, preparing for a day she knew would eventually come. The safe opened with a soft, satisfying click. Inside were the originals, the real contracts, before Riggins had ever laid his corrupt hands on them. Signed by people who had trusted him, witnessed by Gideon during the years when he had been too drunk and too desperate to question what he was signing. It was every single piece of evidence they needed to prove systematic, long-term fraud. Zadai pulled them out, her hands steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. This was it. 5 years of preparation, 5 years of sacrifice. All of it contained in this single stack of papers that proved her father had been right all along, that the shame had never been his to carry. "Someone's coming," Gideon hissed from his post at the window. Zadai moved fast, gathering the precious documents, shoving them into the bag she had brought. They could hear voices outside, multiple people getting closer. "The back door," Gideon urged, his voice tight with panic. They were halfway through the storage room when the front door of the office burst open. Riggins's voice echoed through the office, sharp with suspicion. "I told you I heard something in here!" Zadai and Gideon exploded through the back door and into the alley, running hard toward the shadows where they had left their horses. Behind them, shouts erupted. Riggins had seen the open safe. He had seen the missing documents. He understood immediately what had just happened. They rode through the darkness, the bag of evidence held tight against Zadai's body, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. But they had a lead. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough time to reach the one person who could turn these documents into a weapon. Eula Moss lived 3 miles outside of town in a small, crooked house that leaned slightly to one side. She was 74 years old and nearly blind, but her memory was as sharp as broken glass. She had been present when Riggins had first approached Zadai's father with his falsified debts. She had tried to speak up, but had been dismissed as a confused old woman. But she remembered everything. And her testimony, combined with the original documents, would be impossible to deny. Zadai pounded on the door, just as the dawn was breaking pink and orange across the eastern horizon. Behind them, in the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching horses. Riggins was coming, but they had what they needed now. They had the truth. And the truth, when it was properly presented, was stronger than any threat Riggins could ever make. The door creaked open. Eula squinted at them, recognition slowly dawning on her weathered face. "I have been waiting 23 years for someone to come knocking on this door," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I was starting to wonder if anyone ever would." Zadai held up the bag of documents. "We need you to tell your story, all of it, today, in front of witnesses who matter." Eula smiled, a fierce, powerful expression that showed a glimpse of the young woman she had once been. "Then, we had better move fast," she said, "because Dalton Riggins does not lose gracefully." The gathering happened at noon. They met in the largest building available, the community hall where disputes were traditionally settled. Word had spread through the town like wildfire. Preston came, and with him were 6 other men whose contracts Zadai had documented. The town clerk arrived, carrying his official ledgers. 3 merchants who had witnessed Riggins's questionable dealings over the years also came. Even the circuit judge, who happened to be passing through town, decided to stay when he heard what was being alleged. Riggins arrived last, his face a carefully constructed mask of confidence. He looked at the assembled crowd with the bored expression of a man who had weathered false accusations before and had always emerged unscathed. But when he saw Zadai standing at the front of the room, with Gideon at her side, and old Eula Moss seated in a chair between them, something flickered across his features.
It wasn't quite fear, and it wasn't quite recognition. It was something closer to the grim acceptance of the inevitable. The judge called the gathering to order.
Zadie stood, the stolen documents laid out neatly on the table before her. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She simply presented the facts, in a voice that was calm and clear, and carried to every corner of the silent room. She showed Preston's original contract next to the altered version. She pointed out where the interest rates had been changed from yearly to monthly, where key terms had been rewritten, where Riggins's own handwriting betrayed the modifications he had made. Then she showed 5 more contracts, all with the exact same patterns of fraud. All of them witnessed by Gideon during the years when he had been too desperate to read what he was signing. Gideon testified next. His voice was steady as he described what he had seen over the years, the meetings where Riggins pressured him to witness documents without allowing him time to read them, the promises that everything was legitimate, the gradual, sickening realization that he had been an active participant in systematic fraud. Then Eula spoke. Her voice was thin with age, but it was clear and strong. She described watching Riggins approach Zadai's father 23 years ago with claims of debt that did not exist. She described seeing the original papers before Riggins altered them. She described trying to speak up and being dismissed and threatened into silence. She had kept that silence for over 2 decades, believing no one would ever listen to an old woman with no power. But she had never forgotten. She had never stopped hoping that someone would one day come and ask the right questions. Riggins tried to defend himself. He claimed the documents were forgeries. He claimed Zadai had manufactured the evidence because of some imagined grudge. He appealed to prejudice, suggesting that a woman of her low position could not possibly have the intelligence or the resources to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. He claimed she was being manipulated by someone else with a real agenda. But the documents were authentic. The merchants confirmed the transactions they had witnessed. The clerk verified that the numbers from his own ledgers matched the originals, not the altered versions. Preston and the other men all testified to threats and pressure tactics that matched the patterns Riggins had used for years. The evidence just kept building, stone by stone, like a wall, until there was no space left for any doubt. The judge ruled before sunset. Every contract Riggins had altered would be restored to its original terms. Every falsified debt would be nullified. Every property taken through fraud would be returned to its rightful owner, or to their heirs. And Riggins himself would forfeit all of his holdings to cover the damages he had caused. It wasn't a criminal trial. There would be no prison. But in a territory where a man's reputation and credit were everything, it was a death sentence of a different kind. Dalton Riggins left the hall a completely broken man. His empire had dissolved. His power was shattered. His name was now synonymous with fraud. Zadie stood outside as the people slowly dispersed, the immense weight of 5 long years finally lifting from her shoulders. Gideon came to stand beside her. His own debt was cleared. His land had been returned to him. His complicity had been forgiven in exchange for his honest testimony. "What will you do now?" he asked. Zadie looked out at the territory that had once belonged to her father, the land that would now be returned to her as his heir, the properties that would become hers through the debts she had legitimately purchased. "I'm going to do what my father always wanted to do," she said quietly. "Build something that lasts. Help families who need land. Create opportunities that don't come with hidden strings attached." She paused, then turned to him. "And I'm going to need a partner, someone who understands the business, someone who knows how to recognize fraud when he sees it." Gideon looked at her, and a slow understanding dawned on his face. This wasn't a marriage of convenience anymore. This was an offer of a genuine partnership built on respect and a shared purpose. "I would be honored," he said. 3 months later, Zadai Harland stood on land that was legally and rightfully hers, watching as 2 families moved onto properties she had helped them purchase with fair terms and clear, honest contracts. Gideon worked beside her, sober and focused, his knowledge of local business proving to be invaluable. The invisible empire she had built in secret was now operating in the broad daylight, and it was more powerful for being legitimate. Riggins disappeared from the territory entirely, his name mentioned only as a cautionary tale about greed and corruption. And Zaidai, the woman who had spent 5 years of her life being invisible, finally allowed herself to be seen. If you enjoyed this story of patience, strategy, and justice, click on the video appearing on your screen right now to watch another compelling tale where courage and determination reshape destinies in unexpected ways. Before you go, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. If you want to support us in bringing more narratives like this one to life, consider leaving a super chat. Your financial support helps us invest in better production quality and allows us to dedicate more time to crafting these detailed stories. Every contribution, no matter the size, makes a real difference in keeping this channel going and bringing you more powerful tales from the frontier. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.